In the heart of the cold, dense wilderness, far from any town or settlement, there was a small logging village known as Black Hollow. The village had always been a quiet place, where people kept to themselves and where the thick canopy of trees seemed to swallow all sound. The village thrived on the timber trade, but the isolation weighed on its people, slowly chipping away at their sanity. Black Hollow was a place where the winters were long and brutal, where the darkness lingered far longer than the light. It was during one such winter that the legend of the Axeman began. The Axeman was not born of madness. His name was Elias Thorne, a man once known for his strength and skill as a woodsman. He had lived in Black Hollow all his life, a quiet man with few friends but respected for his work. Elias was a large man, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by years of hard labor. His eyes were always downcast, his voice rarely more than a low rumble. But beneath that exterior, something darker festered. Elias had lost his wife, Maria, to the fever that swept through the village one winter, leaving him alone with their young daughter, Evelyn. The loss had broken something inside him, something that had once tethered him to the world of the living. After Maria's death, Elias became more withdrawn, spending long hours deep in the forest, cutting down trees and splitting logs with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The rhythmic swing of the axe became his only solace, the sound of wood splitting beneath the blade a dull echo in his mind. But the darkness in Elias's heart grew. It whispered to him in the quiet of the night, feeding on his grief and loneliness, twisting his thoughts into something monstrous. He began to see shadows where there were none, hear voices that weren't there. And always, those voices told him the same thing: blood would bring peace. One bitterly cold night, when the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of wailing souls, something inside Elias snapped. The line between reality and the dark whispers blurred, and he could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from the sinister murmurs that had taken root in his mind. It began with Evelyn. She had been sleeping peacefully in her small bed, bundled beneath layers of blankets to keep out the cold. Elias stood over her, the axe in his hand, its blade gleaming in the pale moonlight that filtered through the cracked window. The voices in his head urged him on, promising that this would end his suffering, that this would bring him peace. His grip tightened on the axe handle as he raised it high above his head. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, her small face filled with confusion and fear as she saw her father standing over her. But before she could scream, the axe came down. The blade sank deep into her chest with a sickening thud, and blood sprayed across the room, staining the walls and the blankets. Evelyn's body convulsed once, then lay still, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Elias felt nothing as he stood over his daughter's body, the voices in his head momentarily silenced. But the peace was fleeting, and soon the whispers returned, louder than ever. They demanded more, and Elias, lost to the madness, obeyed. The next victim was old Marcus, a hermit who lived on the outskirts of the village. Marcus was a reclusive man, who rarely spoke to anyone and was rumored to dabble in dark magic. The villagers avoided him, but Elias found him easily enough, stumbling through the snow to his ramshackle cabin. Marcus was sitting by the fire when Elias broke down the door, the cold air rushing in like a specter. He didn't even have time to react before the axe was buried in his skull, splitting it open like a rotten melon. Blood and brain matter splattered across the floor as Marcus's body slumped forward, the firelight casting flickering shadows over the grisly scene. Elias pulled the axe free with a grunt, the voices in his head growing louder, more insistent. The blood on his hands felt warm, comforting, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The axe had become an extension of his will, a tool of destruction that answered the dark call within him. He moved through the village like a phantom, his footsteps silent in the snow, the cold numbing him to everything but the insatiable hunger for blood. House by house, he made his way through Black Hollow, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. There was the blacksmith, Jameson, who fought back with his hammer, but it was no match for the sharp edge of Elias's axe. The blade cleaved through his arm, sending it spinning across the room in a spray of blood, before sinking into his chest with a crunch of bone. Jameson's screams echoed in the night air, but they were soon silenced as the axe finished its gruesome work. Then there was Martha, the widow who lived with her 2 young sons. Elias found them huddled together in their small home, the door barricaded in a futile attempt to keep him out. But Elias was strong, and the madness gave him even more strength. He broke down the door with a few heavy swings of his axe and dragged them out, one by one. Martha begged for mercy, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded for the lives of her sons. But Elias was beyond reason, beyond mercy. He brought the axe down on her head, the blade cutting through flesh and bone with a sickening squelch. Her sons tried to run, but Elias caught them easily, their small bodies no match for his brute strength. Their cries echoed through the night, but there was no one left to hear them. By the time the sun began to rise, Black Hollow had been reduced to a slaughterhouse. Blood stained the snow, and the bodies of men, women, and children lay scattered throughout the village, their lifeless eyes staring up at the pale morning sky. Elias stood in the center of it all, the axe dripping with blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The voices in his head were silent now. The madness had burned itself out, leaving only an empty shell of a man standing amidst the carnage he had wrought. Elias looked down at his hands, covered in blood, and for the first time since that terrible night began, he felt something other than the cold emptiness. Horror. He dropped the axe and fell to his knees, his mind slowly returning to him as he took in the full scope of what he had done. The blood, the bodies, the faces of the people he had known all his life, friends, neighbors, his own daughter, they stared back at him, accusing him, condemning him. Elias let out a scream, a sound of pure agony and despair that echoed through the forest and across the frozen lake. He wanted to die, to end the torment that now consumed him, but death would not come for him. Not yet. He wandered into the forest, leaving behind the ruined village, and was never seen again. Some say he died out there, his body claimed by the elements. Others believe he became one with the forest, a vengeful spirit haunting the woods, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too close to Black Hollow. The village was abandoned after that night, the few survivors fleeing and never returning. Black Hollow became a ghost town, a place shrouded in legend and fear. But the story of the Axeman of Black Hollow lived on, whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. And somewhere, deep in the forest, where the trees grow thick and the shadows stretch long, the sound of an axe swinging through the air can still be heard, echoing through the silence of the woods.